Today we are doing a deep dive into art and architecture, pretty exciting stuff,
Mhm.
and specifically medieval and Renaissance periods. And we've
Yeah.
got some fascinating notes comparing the two. It seems like it's a lot more than just, pointed arches versus domes, but really like a whole different way of seeing the world. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's about how art and architecture really reflect the ideas and the beliefs of the time period. So it's super interesting to kind of see how those things evolve over time.
so first up, the medieval period. I mean, we always hear about knights and chivalry and religion, but our notes also mentioned like an emphasis on violence, which is interesting. So, like, how did that actually show up in the art of that period?
Well, I mean, castles, weren't just for show. They were really built for protection from the violence and all the conflict that was happening at the time. And tapestries depicted battles and, a lot of the religious art even showed stories of martyrdom.
Huh. Interesting. That's a pretty big contrast to how we kind of romanticize that time period today.
Yeah.
So, speaking of contrasts, the notes also describe medieval painting as like unrealistic and two-dimensional and a prevalent use of bright colors.
Mhm.
So it seems like they weren't even really trying to create a realistic image.
Well, yeah. I mean, the focus was really on the spiritual realm, not necessarily the accuracy of the physical world. So bright colors, weren't meant to be realistic, but to evoke divine light.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting how limitations like not having the techniques for like realistic depth actually led to such a unique style. And that style extended into the architecture too. We see the Gothic and Romanesque styles with the pointed arches and turrets, cathedrals and castles that like reach for the heavens.
Right. Yeah, it's about drawing the eye upwards towards the heavens. It was all very symbolic, the spires and the arches. And, even those imposing castles were a powerful symbol of earthly power protection during a time of a lot of conflict.
Okay, so let's move on to the Renaissance now. So this is a period where there's this like renewed interest in classical ideas alongside Christianity. It just feels like a huge shift in perspective.
Yeah, it's a blend, not necessarily a rejection of Christianity, but more like a rediscovering of Greek and Roman philosophies and art and a celebration of human potential, kind of a focus on the here and now instead of just looking up.
Yeah. And that is so clearly reflected in the art. The notes mention realism, the human body, emotions, and this like three-dimensional approach. Paintings really become like windows into this world that feels tangible and relatable.
They were using techniques like linear perspective. Brunelleschi pioneered this using math and geometry to create a sense of depth that hadn't really been seen before. They wanted to understand and replicate the world around them.
Wow, using math for art, that's pretty cool.
Uh,
So it wasn't just about seeing things differently, but understanding the world differently.
Yeah.
And the same goes for their architecture, too. We see a shift to a classical style with domes and columns and curved arches, much more grounded and balanced.
Yeah. Exactly. Think of St. Peter's Basilica with its grand dome, or the symmetry of structures like the Palazzo Medici, bringing back these classical ideals of harmony and proportion.
So, okay, we've talked about these periods separately, but let's kind of get into some specifics here. Um, how did the depiction of the human figure actually, like, differ between the medieval and Renaissance art?
Okay, so in medieval art, the human form was often elongated, almost like an ethereal being, not really individual characteristics. But in Renaissance art, they were studying anatomy and depicting accurate musculature, and you see emotion in the faces.
Okay, and what about, like, the arches? What's the symbolic difference between, like, the pointed arch in medieval
Right.
versus, like, a rounded arch in Renaissance?
Yeah, good point. The pointed arch, it was all about reaching for the heavens, spiritual aspiration. But a rounded arch, it kind of conveys a sense of stability and balance. So it represents that shift to a more earthly focus.
Wow, it's amazing how every little detail, the shape of an arch, the use of color, it all tells a story about that time.
Absolutely. It's about more than just aesthetics. It's an expression of the culture's values.
Yeah. It's been a really cool deep dive into these two periods, going from like the spiritual world of medieval art and architecture to the more humanist focus of the Renaissance, and how these changes in style really show that shift in perspective is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of, next time you encounter a painting or a building or whatever, just think about what the world was like when it was created and what the artists were trying to convey. It can really enhance your appreciation, I think.
That's a great point. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on this deep dive into art and architecture. We'll see you in the next one.